Good morning. Please join me in Gasho. And how could we now expect to reach that precious land? It is indeed the power of our guide, who appeared in the Saha world. But for the encouragement of our guide, our true teacher, how would we be able to enter Amida's land? Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda, Namanda, Namanda. So good morning. Thanks for having me deliver the talk this morning. This is my first time with AV, so hopefully it'll work out. Today I'd like to talk about a bunch of things. It's been a while since I've stood up here, and I'd sort of decided to step away from this kind of thing. But lately I've been feeling more inspired by our temple and by Jodo Shinshu in general. A lot of that has to do with Reverend Kusunoki, and I'll get to that at the end part of my talk. I want to start out by talking about the idea of beauty in Buddhism. And I should forewarn you that the first part of my talk will be a little bit theoretical, but I promise to bring it down to earth for the second part. The word beauty doesn't really come up that often when we talk about Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. It's kind of implied when we talk about the descriptions of the jewels and trees and the golden sand beaches that are said to exist in the Pure Land. But we never really talk about beauty directly. I'm bringing up this subject now because Reverend Irene Goto got me thinking about that interconnection between beauty and Buddhism. She wanted this to be the focus of our talk at the convention last month, but she ended up pivoting to fast fashion instead. But she'd started me down this road, and I found it hard to stop thinking about it. So I made up some slides for the convention that I'll share with you today. The title of my presentation is Beauty and the Buddhist. I wanted to include a picture from the movie, but then I thought it would probably violate copyright laws. The questions that I'd like us to think about today are, how do we experience beauty? And why is this an important part of a Buddhist life? So these questions were of great interest among the intellectuals and religious-minded thinkers in ancient India, both during and prior to the time of the lifetime of the Buddha. A whole philosophy emerged that attempted to describe how we perceive and experience not only beauty, but the world around us in general. And this is called the Abhidharma. And Abhi means higher or above. So Abhidharma in Sanskrit can be translated as a higher teaching or law. The Abhidharmists were trying to figure out how external things enter our consciousness. So how does the world out there get into here? And the theory that they came up with was very simple, and one that we take for granted today. They said that we experience the world through our bodies, through our senses, through our vision, our hearing, through smell, taste, and touch, and finally through our minds and our experiences. Because this sounds very obvious to us today, it's hard for us to understand how radical this idea was at the time. The reason that it was radical was that when we say the world is created through our minds and our senses, it means that it is not created by any sort of godlike figure. It took until the 18th century for this kind of thinking to come to the West, because until that point, they were quite sure that God made the world and that we just passively inhabit it. It's hard to overstate the significance of the self or individual in Buddhist thought. The first line of the most famous of all Buddhist texts, the Dhammapada, states, and I quote, "The mind is the forerunner of all things." In other words, our minds make our worlds. The upshot of this is that when there are problems or suffering in the world, we don't go to God to get them fixed. Instead, we need to fix them ourselves by fixing our minds. Suffering comes about because our minds and our bodies are influenced by the three poisons of greed, anger, and ignorance. Input from the outside world becomes distorted by these poisons as it enters our consciousness. Because of this, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we fear that it is. There's a classic Buddhist story of a man walking through the forest. When he sees a rope, his mind is confused by his remembered fear of a rope-like shape, and he immediately perceives the rope as a snake, and he runs in terror from the forest. So how do we get from confusion to reality? That, I think, for all of us is the million-dollar question. For when we can recognize reality as it is, we can attain all sorts of nice things, like liberation, nirvana, suchness, tathagata, enlightenment, bliss, and peace of mind. But if we continue to interpret the world falsely through the lens of the three poisons, it will only lead to more suffering. So this is where beauty comes in. And I love this philosopher by a German philosopher, this quote by a German philosopher, Friedrich Schelling. He says, "Every artwork is the expression of the absolute itself. Art is the intersection between the real and the ideal." In other words, beauty or art can help us to interpret the world in a way that is not distorted by the three poisons. Art frames what we see in such a way that we recognize truth and reality, and it does this through the vehicle of feelings. There's a common misconception that feelings have no place in the Buddhist path, but that's just silly. I think that feelings aren't magnified or expressed in the same way in ancient Buddhist writings as we talk about them today, but feelings are an incredibly important part of us as people and as Buddhists. Something stirs within us as our senses become deeply moved by art or beauty. It's not nirvana, but it's a nudge in that direction. It changes the way our minds normally think. Shinran called this process crosswise transcending. It's when the trajectory of our thoughts, the way they normally go, get sort of bumped off course. And this is what beauty can bring to our lives. So how does this happen? I don't know if there's any scientific explanation, but somehow through some magical combination of factors, when we are exposed to something beautiful, it inspires us an elevated feeling and brings to us a new level of understanding and perception. Beauty makes us see the real in reality. This is the last of my slides, but I wanted to include this quote by Carolina Schlegel, who was actually the wife of Friedrich Schelling. I think it speaks to the significance of beauty, not just in Buddhism, but also in the world that we are currently living in. When the world goes up in flames like a scrap of paper, works of art will be the last living sparks. So that ends the philosophical part of my talk. Now I'd like to talk about what this means to me personally and why I'm feeling so inspired lately. As you might have noticed, if any of you listened to any of my talks during COVID, I was really struggling to find meaning in Jodo Shinshu at that time. I think that prior to COVID, I'd been at the temple for 10 years, and the newness of the teaching had worn off. Digesting Buddhist talks and writing at that time felt kind of to me like chewing cardboard. All the life and zest had gone out of it. Listening to talks on Zoom and giving talks on Zoom was just not fulfilling to me. But coming back to temple has given me a new appreciation for our Rinban, for our community, and for what we're all doing here. I never really noticed how beautiful our chanting and our service were until I stepped away from them for a few years. To be honest, I sort of took Reverend Kusunoki for granted before COVID. Not that I didn't really love having him here, but I didn't have a clear understanding of his life and his mission and how much he cares about both learning about the Buddhist path and bringing us along, all along with him. It hasn't been easy to keep things going, but he never falters, not even when he has had personal setbacks. I just can't help but be inspired by his commitment. And this commitment is contagious. Our Sangha seems smaller now, but it feels like each and every member is pulling with all their weight to bring things along. So I wanted to end my talk by saying thank you to everyone in our Sangha for your heroic efforts over the past couple of years and for your tireless dedication to the Jodo Shinshu path. I am in awe. Please join me in Gassho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda Butsu. Namanda Nama.